This is Teaching for Student Success. I'm Stephen Robineau. This is now 2023. Happy New Year to all. I thought I'd take a minute to share some data about this podcast. Teaching for Student Success launched in October of 2021, about 15 months ago. We're thrilled to announce that we have listeners in over 1,100 cities in 63 countries on 6 continents. We think that's pretty cool. This year, we'll have to find some listeners in Antarctica. 23 episodes have been released with over 7,500 downloads. Thank you so much for listening. Our goals for this year? Well, we plan to release another 20 or so episodes. We're working on providing transcripts for all episodes. And our biggest goal for this year is to increase our listenership. We're open to ideas about how to do that. However, the most important way really is word of mouth. So if you enjoy an episode, please share it with your colleagues. We'd also like to know if our listeners are interested in swag, t-shirts, coffee mugs, something else. If you have ideas about increasing listenership or swag, please contact us through our website, teachingforstudentsuccess.org. There is a contact link at the bottom of the landing page. Enough of that. Now let's get to today's episode. Inclusify your teaching. Learning is for everyone, with Dr. Kelly Hogan and Dr. Viji Sathy. In virtually all of higher education, our classrooms are more diverse than ever. At least our introductory classes are more diverse than ever. At bachelor degree granting institutions, cohorts become less diverse as they progress through the academy. We as faculty can point to lots of issues about why students don't persist, and particularly why some of our most diverse students don't persist. But we can't control all those issues. What we can control is the learning environment we provide our students. And until each of us is perfect, there will always be room for improvement. We are educators. We've chosen to be educators. As such, we have an ethical responsibility to our students, all of our students, not just those in the front row, not just those that come to office hours, not just the ones that look like us, not just the ones that think like us. We each have an ethical responsibility to offer the best, most equitable, most effective, most impactful learning environment possible. To achieve this, most of us have work to do, work that will impact the lives of all of our students, including many of our most diverse that have been marginalized and historically excluded. The work that needs to be done might not be easy. The issues won't be solved in a day or a week, but the problem is solvable. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Viji Sathy and Dr. Kelly Hogan to Teaching for Student Success to discuss their recently released book, Inclusive Teaching: Strategies for Promoting Equity in the College Classroom, published by the West Virginia University Press. Dr. Hogan is a STEM teaching professor in the Department of Biology, the Associate Dean of the Office of Instructional Innovation, and Director of the university's Quality Enhancement Plan at the Chapel Hill campus of the University of North Carolina, UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Viji Sathy, also at UNC Chapel Hill, is a professor of the practice in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, Associate Dean of Evaluation and Assessment, and Director of the Townsend Program for Education Research. Welcome, Viji and Kelly. That seems like 2 people and 6 jobs. So I don't know how you find the time. Thank you for joining us on Teaching for Student Success.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk to both of you. Let's start with the purpose of the book. In the intro, I provided my perspective. What's your perspective? What's a problem you were trying to address? How does the book address those problems?
I can get started.
Thanks, Kelly.
So we're both active teachers, lots of experience teaching, and it's easy to be in your own little bubble and think you're doing a great job, but we were both impacted by observations that were made clearer to us. So for me, it came in the form of data and receiving data where I got to see how different demographic groups were doing in a course that I was one of the lead teachers in. And I got to see discrepancies between Black students, white students, Asian students, Latino students. You know, the data were really disappointing to me. And it made me really stop and think about, what does it mean to be a good teacher? I was getting some accolades about being a good teacher. It just felt to me like the outcome of good teaching shouldn't look like the discrepancies I was seeing in those data. And so for me, it really opened up my eyes to ask myself, what can I do differently? What does the course need? What do I need to do to improve learning for all students, but to make sure that these discrepancies can disappear? And so I started really improving my teaching and getting a better sense, doing research around that. The book really shares our experiences as teachers in large STEM courses. That's really the majority of the teaching that we've done. And because we have large courses, it allows us to collect data and provide evidence about what's working.
That's great. Thank you. Viji?
Yeah, I think my story is not too dissimilar from Kelly's, but a slightly different motivation. I was teaching, in particular, an introductory statistics course, and I kept encountering this notion from students. They'd say, I'm just not very good at math. Often that was the first thing they would tell me before they'd even tell me their name sometimes. And I was really disappointed because I knew they were good students. They wouldn't have gotten into our institution otherwise. And I felt they were capable of being successful in the course, but their mindset was that this just wasn't going to go well for them. The other issue I was facing was I was just feeling like the class experience wasn't what I wanted it to be. I was looking out at a sea of faces of, at that time about maybe 280 students. I was doing the work that I had normally done in many years prior of calculating things and sort of looking to see if there was confusion, if they were with me, just feeling like I wasn't getting a good pulse on how things were going and if it was the right rate for them in terms of assimilating the information. And it just felt like it wasn't utilizing my strengths in the classroom to perform a calculation and look for their cues about if they're following me, only to learn in an upcoming assessment that not 100% of them were with me. And so I was going to workshops and learning about learning and tools that were available, and a colleague presented a screencasting tool. And that really just, to me, it was like an aha moment, like, oh, what if I just recorded myself explaining how to calculate something, and then people could watch it at the pace that feels right for them. So I had collected data just because it's a data-oriented class. So I'd been collecting data all along about how things were going, and understanding the pace of lecture was something I kept polling my students about. It was something I felt I needed to level the playing field around, especially in a course. It's cumulative in nature. We build on concepts. And so if you lose somebody early, or if they're just a little bit behind, it can be frustrating for everybody. So I was using data to really inform my decisions about how I might tweak things in my course so that more students were learning at the pace that felt right for them, because it fit better with my mindset that it wasn't about the speed at which they understood the material. It was just about understanding the material.
I love that. It's about getting there.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the course, you want them to get there. That's great. Thank you. One of the things I did late in my career was to hand all new faculty in my college a stack of books on teaching and learning when they joined us. Your book, this book, is a book that I would definitely want to add to that pile. One of the things I like about this book is that it provides, as you both have said, evidence-based strategies that have been tested and shown to improve student performance and often reduce the opportunity gap. Many of these strategies can also be readily implemented in classes both large and small. I thought we might talk about some of your favorite ideas, but before we do that, I sort of want to talk about some of the quotes in your book and thought you might like to expand on them. And I want to start with things dealing with barriers and resistance. Why don't faculty adopt certain practices? What are the things that are keeping from doing that? And I'm not sure this first quote really does that, but maybe it is a definitional sort of thing. One of the quotes from your book at the end, actually, page 223, the absence of exclusion is not necessarily inclusion. Inclusion requires intentional effort.
Mm-hmm.
I like that quote a lot.
Thank you.
Any comment on that?
This idea resonates with a lot of different ideas we have. The absence of noise isn't silence, for example, and that there are some things that you have to actually work towards. It's an attribute that you work towards. And for us, thinking about inclusion really is an intentional effort. I think it's easy to say, well, I'm not being exclusionary because I don't do these things. But what we're saying is, to be inclusive, you have to actually do some active things. and to be monitoring regularly what that looks like and changing. It's one of the big themes that we have. This is never going to end, because who we serve will change and who we are as people will change. Even our content may change. So we have to keep evaluating and thinking about how we might invite more people in, and to think of it as an active process.
Kelly, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think a concrete way of thinking about it could be an example where you throw a question out to your group of students. You're talking, you're explaining something, and then you ask a question. That in itself doesn't feel exclusionary. You're just asking a question to a group of students, but it's not based on inclusion. It's not thinking about who's in your classroom and all the different ways people could think about participating and why they're comfortable and not comfortable. The way we talk about it in our book is to say, this needs more structure. It might be that you say a question, but immediately people didn't hear it entirely. We want to make sure that there's a visual cue as well. And then students aren't quite sure how they should respond. Maybe they need some time to think. Putting in a cue that says, I'm going to give you a minute to think, and I'm not going to take any responses until everybody's had a minute to think. And then I want you to turn to a partner and talk about that, right? So like scaffolding all the different things is really important. And then thinking about varying all those different modes. Some students really like to talk out loud. Some like to write. Some like to talk in small groups. Some like to talk in large groups. Some like to be anonymous because we know students are afraid of being wrong in front of their peers. All of those things matter, but we can't just leave it to chance that students will figure out how to do something like that. And that really is the main message of our book. A lot of it is about the process of being more intentionally inclusive.
Thank you. That's great. We will talk about that word you used. I won't say that word at the moment. Mm-hmm. You use it all the time. We're going to talk about that word soon. Here's another quote from the beginning of your book, page 16. Some educators don't see diversity and inclusion as having anything to do with their courses. We face the same skepticism from some students.
Mm-hmm. And I think we see that by disciplines, certain disciplines think that they've got diversity and inclusion covered, and other disciplines like in STEM, it's not always as obvious. But if you're teaching people, you've got diversity and inclusion to worry about for all the reasons you want to include people in the learning. On top of the fact that STEM needs to do a lot better being more inclusive in their curriculum. It's something that I see happening across the disciplines, that sometimes arts and humanities is very focused on the curriculum being about diversity and inclusion and the process in terms of the strategies and teaching, not always as focused on diversity and inclusion, and the vice versa. In STEM, we're seeing a lot of innovation around trying to include students in terms of the teaching strategies, and sometimes not very focused on content and curricula.
Interesting. Viji, anything to add?
Yeah. I think the only thing I might add is that I think that for some people, these words mean very specific things or very specific identities, for example. So they may immediately think about race or ethnicity. What we're arguing for in this book is really that there's a broad set of identities our students come to us with, and we must address all of those. In many ways, the elegance of the whole thing is that when we attune to some of those identities, we actually check the boxes for a lot more people. And one of the ones that we find people really get their aha moment around is when we think about introverts, for example. Mm-hmm. And we talk about how an introvert might interact in a classroom or feel comfortable talking with one another or in a large space. I mean, once we start to name that as an example identity, people start to see, oh, yes, that method could be helpful for somebody who is an introvert. But it turns out that those methods also help other people as well.
Right. So the image that comes to mind as you talk about that aspect of diversity is the iceberg. There's things above the waterline and things below the waterline, and the things above the waterline are easily seen.
Right.
And then there's the things that we can't see, the diversity we can't see. Mm-hmm. Our students are diverse in so many ways, not just how they dress.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to just mention here is, of course, the discipline agnostic nature of everything you're talking about. You both teach in STEM, but the issues you're talking about are, as you mentioned, Kelly, are non-STEM mm-hmm. issues as well. Okay, let's see, where are we? Here's another quote. It's a longer one, sorry. We contend that so long as diversity, equity, and inclusion are relegated to only certain disciplines, offices, or individuals on campus, they will never become an ethos adopted by all. If we as a society value diversity, equity, and inclusion, then every member of the community should make them part of their work. So I guess the question I have here, I wrote this down. I said, I agree with the statement. Should diversity offices on campuses be shut down? Does having an office of diversity put it in a corner where somebody says, oh, well, that's their problem, they'll take care of it, as opposed to it being my problem and being inculcated throughout the academy? I'm a little facetious when I say should it close down. How do you build it into every day? How do you make it a part of everybody's faculty and staff, their ethos in everyday life on campus and off campus?
Yeah, it should be a goal to want to shut those offices down.
Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, they're not ready to be shut down because there's still so much more work to do. But yeah, everybody needs to take ownership of it, no matter what their area is, whether it's teaching, research, all the committee work, faculty searches. All of those things require this lens of diversity and inclusion. We often see, being in the academy, it falls on a few people who are the nudges in certain meetings. We don't think about diversity broadly as a thread through all of these different things that we do.
It's a little unfair. This is an institutional change question, and that's not the focus of your book. So we shouldn't go too far down this rabbit hole, other than to say I had dinner with a friend last night who has a position on a particular campus in a particular college. One of the interesting discussions we had lots of interesting and fun discussions. One of them had to do with the diversity training that happens in their college once a year for 3 hours the week before classes start. That's diversity training for that college. And this person knows that is insufficient, shall we say. It certainly doesn't distribute the importance of the issue throughout the year. And I suspect many places do exactly that. We're going to have a day of this. We're going to have a retreat. We're going to do this. But they don't build it into the daily or the weekly or monthly meetings, department meetings. These things need to be baked into events that happen much more close to home for them, don't they?
I would say so. And I think that we run the risk of absolving ourselves of having done the work when we say we've gone to the workshop or we've done, we've checked the box, for example.
Yeah.
Without connecting the dots with how our actions in our everyday work might impact different people that we work with or the audiences we serve or, any number of things.
I think you also hit on something that comes back to our book too, that we tried to weave our ideas around inclusion through everything we do. Like you could also imagine somebody doing something on the first day that states their values around diversity and inclusion and then not really carrying that through the whole semester in all their interactions. And so chapter by chapter, we really do think about what do inclusive office hours look like? What does inclusive communication look like? What is the first day? What does the last day look like? All of those things.
Right. That's great. Now we'll get to your favorite word. The favorite word used throughout this book, we'll use two words a lot, but there's only one that's relevant to teaching, and that is structure. So let's talk a little bit about structure. Can you define what you mean by structure in your courses, in your book? Just to give people an idea, a concrete idea of what that means.
All right. So I think an easy one for everyone to think about where structure, with the lack of structure, can really lead people astray is when we have students work in groups. So when students work in groups, whether it's a long-term project or even just in a class session, turn to your neighbors and chat about this or get into small groups. When you think about what happens when you don't provide any sort of instruction around how those interactions will go, one thing that could very easily happen is you say, turn and talk to the people around you. And there might be somebody in the vicinity who now they don't know the three people, but those three people know each other and they've immediately worked into a group. And now this person is feeling left out because they're not part of that group. We didn't assign groups. We didn't make sure that everybody is part of a group. And then if you think about a longer term project, how do people work effectively in teamwork? And how do we help students understand how to do that? Everybody knows that students do group work throughout their education, but they assume that by the time they come to their classroom, that just because they've done it, that they know how to do it well. What we're saying when we mean adding structure is thinking about who might be left behind because we're not providing the structure that's necessary, either assigning people to groups or thinking about things that could help facilitate good group work, like what are roles that people could play in a group setting? What's a group contract that they could maybe create together to mitigate against any issues that might arise in the group? Really thinking through all of the kinds of things that we know make teamwork work well. We shouldn't withhold that information. We should actually be teaching our students how to do that. And I think that's our primary motivation when we think about structure, is not leaving it to chance, that students know how to do these things and that we are the experts. So we should be helping them to meet those goals and not handing them to them, but actually helping them practice those skills.
The other way we think about structure is the course design. So Viji gave an example that was really more about students interacting either with us or with each other. But the course design is something that, like, if I look at a syllabus, I can probably pick out a low structure course pretty easily. And what I mean by that is a course that maybe has 1 or 2 exams and a final, or maybe it's 1 or 2 papers and some final assessment. The whole grade is based on that, and there's no practice getting them there. So if you think about a typical STEM student where they might have just a couple of really big exams, we know, and I know personally firsthand, teaching a lot of first-year students coming from high school, that they will wait until the night before and study and cram. But not everybody. Some students have this know-how to do college. They will break it up a little bit at a time. They will do exactly what we think learners should do as experts: break it up, distribute it over time, repeated practice. And yet only some students know how to do that, depending on which kind of background and experience they've come from. If we bring in a higher structure, it will look more like frequent practice, assessments, lots of questioning during class, outside of class. Doesn't have to be worth a lot of points in any way, but the structure is there to say, this is not optional. This is how learning works, and we're going to help you build this structure so that everybody can succeed and have that opportunity to succeed. And as Viji said, we don't leave it to chance that some students know how learning works and others don't. And we don't want to keep replicating inequities that are persistent before we even meet our students.
Right. This gets to something you talk about in the book called TTQs, typical test questions. And one of the things, right, the structure, the notion that if you want them to do something on a test, there's some skill you want them to display during a test. The test shouldn't be the first time they see a question like that. The whole point is to give them practice so that when they get to the test, they can demonstrate that skill, right? So I like that notion of typical test questions. So that's sort of jumping ahead a bit. The quote related to structure is this: isn't structure just hand-holding? Some faculty are going to say, I'm just holding their hands. It's a tough world out there. You got to learn how to do this. You got to figure it out on your own. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Mm-hmm. That's the way it's got to be. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that for a second. It's quite an attitude.
It is. It's pretty pervasive too. I think not just in our discipline and not just in academia. I think a lot of people feel that because they've encountered something a certain way, that this is the way it must be. But that doesn't lead to progress necessarily. And just because it was potentially hard for you or could have been hard for some, doesn't mean we have to keep making it hard for people. This is where we want to think about just questioning, what is it that we're trying to teach our students? I was just talking with someone recently about the notion of late work and sort of how heavy-handed people can be about turning in things late. And I say, oftentimes I see that, but I don't see anywhere in their learning objectives or skill sets that they say, like, I'm going to help you turn things in on time. Like, that's a very important skill for me in this course. So we have these sort of unspoken things that we stress or articulate to our students, especially around softer skills. There are good reasons to have policies about late work, but the main point is thinking through, what is it we're trying to achieve with our students, and not letting superficial things get in the way of achieving those things. And this discussion about hand-holding, or even sometimes the word rigor, like, to me, it conjures up this exclusionary idea that academia is an exclusive place and only some people can hack it. And that's not right. We admitted our students. We have a responsibility to help them succeed.
Absolutely. I love that. Kelly?
It is something we put in the book because we have heard it as we visit campuses. Inevitably, we get a question along those lines. We try and bring it back to things in the faculty member's life that maybe they appreciate some structure around. When somebody goes to write a grant, they like to know what some of the expectations and guidelines are. And that's what we're saying. Like, if you just walk into a classroom and you start talking at students and they don't know what they're supposed to get out of it, that's confusing. Some students may be able to pull out main ideas and have a sense of what's going to be expected of them, but many are going to just say, like, I just don't know what I was supposed to get out of that, whether it's a lecture or a reading. One of the ways we bring structure into the lecture or the reading is to say, have very clear objectives, or for a reading, provide some guiding questions for students to answer that affect what they'll understand is the expectation. Structure is just about expectation, not to be blaming the students, not to be exclusionary in the way that you're talking about what students should be able to do, and not to blame the teachers that came before you. This is another way of blaming K through 12 teachers or blaming the person in the curriculum ahead of time in them to say, like, well, it's not my job to teach them how to take notes. They should have learned that already. But are you talking to your colleagues in the intro courses about your curriculum and teaching them that skill from the ground up? Often I will say, it's fine if you want to have these skills and become more independent with them, but they're just not going to come out of thin air. There has to be intentional design, maybe from the first year all the way through senior year.
Yeah, becoming lifelong learners doesn't just happen because you use the words. You have to help them learn. You mentioned earlier repeated practice. I love retrieval practice issues. Jeff Karpicke's work, it's fantastic stuff. We've got an interview with him earlier in this podcast. That's great. Thank you. I really appreciate spending some time talking about the larger issues, that are holding people back from adopting, because there's a lot of people that don't adopt.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just related to that last point, I think there's an assumption that we are lowering standards in some way when we do this work. And I want to dispel that now, that we're not saying we are making it easier. We're not challenging our students. That none of those things are happening. It's still high quality work that we're asking of students. We're still challenging them. We're just not putting unnecessary hurdles in their path and trying to make it a more equitable experience.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a section in the book you talk about universal design for learning. You actually start out very early in the book talking about UDL and how that makes things more accessible for everybody without, as you say, without lowering bars. That's a great part of the discussion. I love that. Okay, so I guess it's time to get back to some of your favorite and impactful strategies that you suggest, because I think one of my goals with this podcast is for people to be able to listen to things and walk in the classroom an hour later or the next day and say, let's try something. Let's do something. So one, I encourage everybody to buy your book and read it. It's easily readable. It's not long. It is jam-packed full. It's sort of encyclopedic. You've accumulated, and what I like is that you reference everybody's work. So there's not just your own, but so many others' work that you've compiled into this book to provide these evidence-based strategies for teaching. So it's great. So I thought we'd go around the room, so to speak, and maybe talk about some of your favorite, most impactful strategies. We don't have to cover the whole book, just a few of the favorites. Viji, why don't you go first this time?
Okay. One of my favorites is when you ask students a question, just stop talking and give them some time to think. And I think this is a strategy that we use a lot in our classroom to pose a question to the group. And as Kelly has said, there's a lot of different ways we might solicit answers, but an easy fix would be to just wait what feels like an unreasonably long time in your mind because you're in the front of the classroom and it's quiet, but probably 7 to 10 seconds, setting a timer, your students will get used to that silent time. And you can even tell them the reason that I'm going to pause after I ask a question. I'm not going to call on the very first hand that goes up if it goes up immediately, is because I want to allow everybody a chance to formulate an idea. And for me, this is really important because I think about my own, how I think about things. Like if you ask me a question, I need a little time to not just think about what I might say, but actually how I might phrase it. Maybe even practice it once in my mind before I share it out loud in a group. I think there are a lot of people like me who really appreciate that time to think quietly and to be able to practice what they might say. And so just pausing after posing a question can be a really powerful technique.
Right. So it's more inclusive because it gives lots of people, everyone in class, more time to consider the question at hand. And then what about the response to that question? Like raising hands is it's what people do, but maybe that's not a very inclusive approach. So I assume you provide lots of alternatives to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, just saying it out loud, right? That's not inclusive. It should also be in a visual format somewhere so that people may be able to reread the question if they would like to think about it a little bit more. And also, varying the ways that you might report out. It doesn't have to be just waiting for hands. Maybe you make it a practice to pick on the fourth or fifth hand that goes up. I mean, that's like a really easy approach to just say, I still want to do this sort of call and response thing in my classroom, but I want to wait, and I want to wait on the response side of it too, like waiting for several hands to go up before I might choose one. Our students do really get comfortable with the different techniques we use. So I would just say, you could start with that, but then think about how you might vary it. Maybe they write something down on an index card and they don't have to put their name on it, and they get shuffled around the room and students get to share some, or maybe they wad it up and throw it at you and you pick a few to read out loud. Just thinking through, especially the types of questions you're asking, would a student feel comfortable just owning their answer? And if not, what might be anonymous ways to ask these questions?
Right. Students are so scared to be wrong, right? To fail, that you certainly don't want to ever embarrass a student in a class. Kelly, what's one of your top strategies?
So something that I developed later as a teacher, but is super impactful, is what Kimberly Tanner tells us is called instructor talk. And it's the non-content talk that we do in our disciplines. And it's something that can make a classroom feel far more inclusive when used intentionally. It can help level the playing field in helping students learn how learning works. So for example, just the other day, a student, as I was walking around the room, a student wasn't even concerned about the content, but was like, why are we doing this again? I thought this was from the first unit. And I said, okay, yeah, we're doing it again because that's how learning works. We're going to spiral back to it. We're going to learn it a little deeper in a different context, but that's a great question. I'm going to make sure I share that with everybody, right? And then it reminded me to talk about how learning works. And it's not just the first day I talk about how learning works. I try and bring it into every question. Like everybody just did a poll question on their own. Maybe only 60% of the class got it right. They talked to each other, and now 95% of the class has it right. It's an opportunity to not just say, good job, but to say, this is great. You see how you learn from talking and explaining and collaborating with someone. This is how you should be thinking about learning in general, right? So you're constantly giving them those coaching tips. But you can also use instructor talk to really make people feel more included and a sense of belonging. So for example, after a first exam, if you've got, in my case, a lot of first year students, first science class, first exam, a 79 can sting to a certain individual who's not used to seeing a grade like that. And they're questioning if they belong at that institution in that major. And just saying something like, hang on a second. You all absolutely belong here. This is how learning works. If you were an expert in biology, you wouldn't need to take this class, and you're being challenged in a good way. And I know you can rise to the occasion, just really making sure people understand you're normalizing that there's room to grow and that it's also okay to make some mistakes. And in my class, they're going to be able to drop an exam. So just allowing them to see that they're going to be able to think about a growth mindset and employ that growth mindset.
Great. Thank you. I've had Kimberly Tanner on. She talked about instructor talk in our second episode. And more recently, I've had Dax Ovid and Mallory Rice talk about instructor talk from the student perspective, which is really interesting about what students hear and what they remember. Super interesting stuff. So I'll join the game. My top one here is learning students' names. came from an article actually out of the NEA little thing that we used to get, the little book pamphlet from the NEA that all instructors used to get, making an effort to learn students' names, even in large classes. I had large classes as well. Changed the game for me. It just changed everything once I started knowing my students by their names. You guys, I'm sure, have had that experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm really bad at remembering names.
I have to fix that.
Okay.
I said you guys, and I should not say that. I apologize.
Good for you for catching it.
Guys is a dangerous word anyway. So I'm sure you both, the two of you, have probably had similar experiences with learning students' names. Maybe we can talk about that. Go ahead.
So I am really bad at remembering names. It takes me a lot of practice to get a name right. So I've experimented with a lot of techniques, and what I've landed with is just name tents at their desks. You know, what's surprising about this, and when we've talked to students about this, you know, they do want you to use their name. They're not necessarily wanting to know that you can remember all 300 students' names, but for a sense of belonging, for an instructor to look out and you've raised your hand and I can say, yes, Michelle, can you tell me what you were thinking? You know, that's a very simple thing to do. And so having name tents has been really, for me, a game changer because I don't feel the pressure to have to learn everyone's names. But over time I do because I'm looking at their names right by their faces all the time. And so it is a really helpful approach for me.
Kelly?
Yeah, just that they appreciate the effort that you're trying. And once again, being explicit to say, could you put your name tents up? Because I really want to try and learn your names. And I also have peer instructors working with me too. So the whole instructional team wants to be able to know your names, as do the peers sitting around you, right? Like a community is based on knowing some basics about each other's identity. And so just reinforcing that, even if we don't all get it right all the time.
Right. So when I used to do this, I started this long ago when there was tape, right? I used to videotape my students on day one. They'd go out. I'd have a bunch of cameras set up and I had TAs who helped with this. And students would come up and they'd tell me their name, what they wanted me to call them, and something unique about them to help me remember. And then eventually I added the name. I actually had them write their name on it, or I printed their name out on a big piece of paper so they'd hold it up so you could see their name in their face. One student told me, her name, and she said, and the thing she told me was, well, yesterday I went skydiving, and I figured if the chute didn't open, I wouldn't have to take your class. It's like a little bit of dark humor, but she was there, and I think I could pull her name out of my head if I thought hard enough. And another student, Oliver, I actually remember Oliver's last name, because I'd ask them what they want to be called, right? Because they don't always want to use their first name. And this student said, well, I've always wanted to be called Megatron. Would you call me Megatron? So the only thing I have ever called this young man was Megatron. I've never called him by his given name. And I think I'm the only person probably ever to call him Megatron. I don't know. It's really funny. That was fun. All right. Let's go back. Viji, we're back to you. Let's do another round or two.
Oh, okay.
Of favorite things.
So are we still in the realm of easily actionable?
You can choose whatever you like, easy or hard, whatever.
Okay. All right. So I think what I would say is for most of us, we have a set of assignments that we ask our students to do. I would hope that they're fairly routine. So there's more than, say, 2 or 3, because that's low structure and we don't want that. I would encourage people to think about how they might think about a growth mindset in their assignments and the way that they are grading those assignments. So I'll give you an example of how this works in my class and how it's evolved. So when I first started, I would give my students routine assignments as you would in a stats course. They're like almost weekly. And then there would be a few exams in the semester and everything was graded and everything counted. Over time, I decided that this was creating a big headache because some students would have to miss an assignment legitimately, or they didn't score perfectly on something, and then I was spending some time talking with them about it. And I just thought, this does not match at all with how I think about how learning works. I think it's okay to make a misstep. And I think I want to convey that in my grading approaches. And so doing things like Kelly mentioned about the grading, like lowest exam grade can be dropped. Why not drop a lowest assignment grade? Why not think about not grading things on a 100-point scale where you're artificially actually using 60 to 100 and 0? just decide what your criteria are. In my case, I have like a really simple 4-point scale. And then just say to students, if I have 10 assignments, well, let's make it 11 just to make the math work out. So 11 assignments, not only does one get dropped, but you don't have to earn 44 points at the end of the semester. You actually only have to earn 36 points at the end of the semester. I'm saying, yeah, you can have the occasional 3s, maybe even a 2, and it's okay. So just really thinking through, how do I show my students that missteps are part of what I expect to happen?
Right. I like that.
All right. I will share something that we both think is simple but brilliant. From talking to lots of faculty, they also agree that it's really helpful. We call them blue boxes because we teach at Carolina and we call them Carolina blue boxes, but we encourage people at different universities to choose their color theme. The idea is that within a lesson, we hopefully are doing active learning because that gives all students repeated practice. But we want to be intentional about how students receive the instructions around that. So within the blue box, after, the top of the screen may have a question or a worksheet might have a question, but the blue box is going to be more explicit about how to engage. Often there will be a timing. So it might say, think alone for 2 minutes and then work with your group. With your group, maybe write an answer, draw something on a whiteboard. And then maybe it will say something like, the person who has the largest pet should volunteer to be the reporter for the group. So something along those lines. And there's a lot of good things that come out of that. It's highly structured. Everybody can see it as they need to. You build community around people talking about their pets really quickly. And as you look up across a whole lesson, you can quickly scan if you're using something like PowerPoint slides, where you can just see, okay, I've got a lot of slides and no blue box. That must mean I'm not engaging with practice enough with my students. Let me think if I can go back and add something that's going to give more structured practice to students. So we found a lot of people really like that simple little idea of the blue box.
Nice. I like that. Yeah. When you first started talking about the blue box, it's like, wait a second, I don't remember reading that. And then when you said on the slide, it's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, right. I like that a lot. So it's very clear. Every slide, every time there's a blue box, they know what that means.
I was going to add, it's not just about them. It's actually about us too. It's a really good tool to sort of keep us in check about what we're doing with our students and to provide, Kelly and I often talk about, there's a lot of content that we often will ask our students to practice in a classroom. And there's a choreography around what we do with our students. And this makes it transparent what the choreography is in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And it forces us to make decisions about how much time will they be working on this in their groups and how will they report out? Especially once you've developed a set of these, you can just copy them over from one slide to another, but you're really not leaving it to chance yourself to let it go astray, that you've got a lot of structure there for yourself to keep things moving.
Right. I like that. I like the visual cue aspect of that. It's very simple on the slide to do and see. I like that a lot. When I used to use clicker questions, those slides would always have a different color background than the rest. Those were always like pale yellow for me. So when it was a pale yellow slide, the students just knew, pick up your clicker. Here we go. The number 2 thing that I have down here is, this is long-term and hard, educator-student relationship. Just to be thinking about that, right? To be thinking about that relationship between you and your students, because if they know you care about them, they're going to care more about the class. And that emotional connection, I think, is important. So I think I like that. One more round?
You could talk about office hours, Viji.
Office hours?
Office hours.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so office hours is another one where we can sort of be creative with how we interact with students. When I first started having office hours with students, it sort of became a matter of habit to ask them, have you ever gone to office hours before? And a lot of students were telling me no, they'd never been. And I would pick their brain a little bit because I felt like they felt comfortable telling me. And I said, why is that? You're now in your 2nd or 3rd year of college. Why might this have not happened? And over time, I started to realize that there's a lot of things that keep students out of office hours. And I wanted to be thinking about how I might help students see the value of going to office hours and lower the barriers for participation. A theme that kept coming up was a few things. One, just feeling nervous or intimidated to come into office hours. You think about it like this is usually the professor's space, potentially the instructor's room that you're going to, a totally different environment. It can feel intimidating to be in another person's space like that. And then the other is like, just what do I do with that time? If I don't have a specific question, why would I go? And so from those conversations, I decided to just think of various ways to interact with students. I started with what I call 5-minute meetings, and I encouraged as many students to sign up with those. And they were 6-minute slots that students would meet with me for 5 minutes. And it was very explicit. This was just for introductions, just to get to know each other. I would make it a personal goal to try to find one thing we had in common with one another, just to keep the conversations going. Students loved that because the commitment was really low, right? Just 5 minutes. Like, that doesn't seem too scary. And I held them outside my office. I would keep them in student union or, in a common space outdoors. So I really wanted it to be a place that felt like it was their place too. That was another approach I used. And then also I said, you could bring a friend. Like, you don't have to do this alone. Just bring somebody. And I remember one time somebody brought a friend, and it wasn't even a friend in the class. It was just a friend that was like, yeah, I'd like to meet your professor too. And so we just sat outside and just chatted for a while. And as the semester progresses, we have, just what we think of as more typical office hours where students can come in and review work. And then towards the end, I would often have many people coming to my office hours for final projects. I just decided to make them sort of co-working office hours. So we'd meet in a common space, sit around a table. And the expectation was that you don't even need to ask me a question. We could just be working together. And if, as a question arises, if you're working on something for my class, I'll be right there to help you, or a peer will be right there to help you. And so just thinking about a variety of ways. And now we have potentially meeting online with students as a way to check in. And I know there are a lot of people who they might be able to offer evening office hours if it's online, if they don't have to actually be on campus. And that could be a good time to connect. So just really thinking about why students may not be going to office hours could be a combination of sort of the affect of intimidation or nervousness, but it could also just be like they don't know what to do with that time. And so we should be transparent about how we might structure office hours so that we are communicating what we expect as might happen in office hours.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the idea of taking it outside or outside your office, whether it's inside or outside somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Student union, if it's a beautiful day, why not outside? And the co-working idea is really interesting. Really interesting. What a community that would develop, right? When you're just out working, you got students surrounding you, they're working, and suddenly you're all talking. That's fantastic. I love that. Kelly?
Yeah, so I think I will offer up a suggestion around the tone and the language that we use, whether it's in a syllabus or an email. First, maybe thinking about like the syllabus or exam instructions. When you say something like, did that get in there? It was a honk?
I was just going to say, don't worry about the honk. It's okay.
Thinking about exam instructions or a syllabus where it says students shall not blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you're a professor or an instructor talking to the students. You don't need to talk in third person. They're people, and this is for them. We don't need to be wagging our fingers all the time, creating this environment that feels cold and sterile and penalizes students. Like, students shall not go to the bathroom during the exam. Well, come on. People have to have bodily functions, whether it's during an exam or not. So it might be changed to say, please let me know if you need to use the bathroom during the exam, or if you need to use the bathroom during the exam, here is what I would prefer you do, right? I mean, there are just nicer ways to say what needs to be said without feeling you're being real punishing about it. But the other thing would be emails. If it's something we can do every day, right, we can stop and think about the emails we have exchanges with our students. In the book, I'll just read it. We have a little excerpt that says, subject, assignment. Dear Dr. Flintstone, I'm really enjoying your class. I just wanted to ask you a quick question about our upcoming assignment. You said it would be okay if we interviewed a family member, right? Sincerely, Lee R. And then the instructor in this fictitious email writes back, correct, as I said in class, Dr. F. Now, probably the instructor's just busy going about their day, answering their emails. But the way that they answered the email, it feels like, I told you so. Yes, read what has already been said and read what's in the syllabus. They miss an opportunity to be welcoming and kind and get to know the student. So, I mean, I think that's something we can all do is slow down for a minute. And if it's not the right time to send the email, don't. But by all means, address the student. Dear Lee, right? I mean, just something to use their name again. So I think that's a common thing that happens, and we don't mean to do it, but we do it. And we frighten away students who are like, well, I'll never ask a professor another question again.
I like that one a lot. Did you want to say something? Did you do that?
Yeah, I that made me think about this idea that we often, sometimes I hear instructors sort of talk about, oh, I said that, or it's in the syllabus, or, just being frustrated that students don't seem to be attuned to something that they feel that they communicated to their students. I understand that frustration, especially if it feels like something you have communicated multiple times in multiple ways. But I also want to remind people that our students are people and they have very complex lives. And our class usually is not the only class that they are taking. And so when we say it's in the syllabus, and let's say our syllabus is maybe, 10 pages, let's say, if they're taking 5 other courses, that's 50 pages of terms and conditions. Whose class is what appropriate for? Like, it's perfectly fine to maybe have a reminder about how things work. And it's because they're getting things, and it's not usually, I don't know that there's any coordinated effort across a lot of different classes to do something a certain way. And so that confusion is real sometimes. And it's also just a part of acclimating to how we do things in academia. And I think if we could just have a little bit more patience with people around that, that would be great.
Yeah, a little more patience, a little gentler.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one more thing to add to that. Being Viji's friend has really opened my eyes to how important saying a name and spelling a name correctly is, because I don't have a name that people usually mess up, but I can't tell you the number of emails we get back that say VJ and spell the name wrong, or put her last name as her first name just because it's not a typical American name. It's eye-opening, and it really matters because it stings every time your name is said wrong or spelled wrong. And you notice it for sure.
You notice it. It really does matter.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for raising that issue. The last one I have that I wrote, it says, laptop bans, ! Ha ha. Give them something better to do. I've had lots of faculty, interact with lots of some faculty who ban technology. My response always was, if you give them something better to do, they will engage. If they're on their computers looking at a YouTube video, think about what's going on in the class when they're doing that. Now, that's a little harsh. My general feeling is students will be responsible with technology, and students will engage in the class if there's something to engage in. If you're going to sit there and not do something interesting, why shouldn't they be doing something with their time? Mm-hmm. They're busy too. I don't know how you react to that, because that's not how you approach this topic in your book. That's my take on the topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think I would say it's funny because we just came off the heels of talking about, like, in the real world, they have to do X, Y, and Z. Like, in the real world, nobody's going to tell them they can't have their laptop out at a meeting, whatever the real world is. But just in general, I think back on my college days before we had cell phones, there were people doing the crossword puzzle in the back of the room. You wouldn't be able to tell. You would think that they were just taking notes. What we're hoping for is that they're engaged in the conversations that we're trying to encourage, and that they're thinking about some of the things that we're posing in the classroom. And hopefully if we're keeping them active enough that there really isn't a lot of opportunity to be distracted, that's the ideal situation. But sometimes it might require just saying, hey, you know what? We don't actually need to have our laptops for this discussion. So why don't we close them, put them away? Let's talk to each other. I definitely found myself saying that with students, just noticing that they are very comfortable having their laptops open, even when they're in a small group. And I know that this is a conversation. So we can just practice this idea of looking at one another when we're speaking, and just nudging them to say, this is a moment where we actually don't need to take any notes.
Right. I don't object to situations like that. It's like, hey, let's put everything away. Let's give our full attention to this. I think that's great. But to have rules that are restrictive, limiting, and arbitrary, what's the purpose of that other than you want them to be paying attention to you all the time? But the notion of, hey, we're a small group or we're a large group, let's put these away now and let's talk. I think that's perfectly a reasonable thing to request also.
Sometimes when people have this policy, it is about them. It's not about their students. It's about what they feel comfortable with or what they need in order to do the work. And I think that's where we run into problems. It should never be about your comfort level. I mean, to some degree, you do need to be comfortable teaching, but it shouldn't require students to be doing something. And that leaves aside the whole conversation around accommodations and students who require a laptop. And if you have a laptop ban and you have some students who need them, then you've just outed them to the whole class. So there's a whole murky area there that we haven't touched upon. But just in general, I think hopefully we're doing things that are in support of student learning and not in support of our personal comfort level.
And you do approach that issue of accommodations in your book. So you do talk about that.
I'll just add the technology around laptops is changing so much. So many of my students now have tablets. Those tools just became so much better in a biology classroom to have a tablet in terms of drawing processes and drawing on top of the data I give them and modeling. So it's like taking away paper and pen to take away a tablet. So we just have to change with the times and recognize. And I think the point we were trying to make in the book around the laptop ban was part of a larger point to say that policies and things are going to arise that we have to really think about the nuance of them, because we might think of reasons why it might be nice to not have laptops out sometimes that are student-centered reasons. And it might be a silly thing to say that's, it's not student-centered. But at the same time, we need to recognize that we're just going to have difficult conversations around inclusion sometimes. And policies are places where that's going to be true. So the pandemic certainly pushed upon us another one, which was cameras on or cameras off. That also became the same kind of contentious argument with laptops. And as Viji said, it was actually really about the professor a lot of times. Like, I want to see you. I want to know that you are paying attention. Well, there are a lot of other tools you can use to know if students are with you rather than you needing to see the students. So it needs to come back to having those nuanced discussions about what does it mean to be student-centered and inclusive, and is this about you or the student?
Right. Great. Thank you. I'd like to end sort of by talking about your personal stories. You've shared at the beginning why each of you wrote this book, and that in itself is our transformational stories, really, your experiences in the classrooms and what you observed. So I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this question this time. I'd like to hear a personal story from each of you if you want to share. Maybe one that you don't share often. Let's do this one. How your work on inclusivity has impacted your life outside of academia. And I mean completely outside of academia, when you're having the rest of your life, which I recognize is academia consumes everything. But, when you're at the market, or when you're out to dinner, if you're going out to dinner anymore, or when you're out exercising or taking a nice walk, or downtown where, in Chapel Hill, how does this perspective influence your life?
Well, I guess I could start. Thinking about inclusion, in some ways, this whole book, we're trying to give people a lens with which to see their teaching. And I almost think of it as like a physical pair of glasses that you wear, and you see the world a little bit differently. And that's what I feel like happens to me when I go out in the world with these glasses on. I see the places where there is no structure and who is left behind because we don't have structure. But more importantly, I also see the places where I can celebrate that there is structure and that somebody has thought about how to enter a space or how people navigate a space. And it's really just refreshing to see these real world examples. I'll give you one that I encountered recently. I was at the airport in Dallas. I was so impressed. As soon as I got off the plane, there were immediate signs about which direction, not just which direction certain gates were and, where the, baggage claim is, which is pretty common, but also where the restrooms were, like which direction and how many minutes to get to the closest restroom. And then you get to the restroom and there's a sign outside that tells you how many empty stalls are in that restroom. And the next restroom, if you choose not to go to this one, how many minutes away is that restroom? Wow. And think about parking garages, when they've got those lights up in the top that says, okay, you drive through and you don't see any, then you just go to the next level, right? Or you can see immediately where there might be an open spot without actually having to drive down it. These are all examples of really excellent signage that really make it so that when you literally land in a place, that you can see where you're supposed to go and how to get there pretty efficiently and not feel lost. Hopefully this is what we're moving towards in a lot of different domains in our life, that people feel like they belong because they know how to navigate the space that they're in. And it's not the sense of confusion and chaos and potentially doing things wrong because they don't have that kind of signage.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. The last question really is about your transformational story. I mean, you both are educators and have really chosen to take at least a big chunk of your career to work on education research. Something in your life, something about you makes education research and this concern about your students important to you. I mean, we talked about why you wrote the book. That's very proximal to the book. I'm wondering if there's an older story that, was transformational that you think of periodically about the importance of that interaction or moment.
The moment that teaching became more about research too.
Yeah, whatever transformational story you want to tell. I don't want to limit it. I just want to provoke it.
Well, what comes to mind for me is this idea of, I always say, my classroom is my laboratory. I was trained as a laboratory scientist, but it's not something you can dabble in. I can't just say on Thursdays, I'd love to be in the lab, or in the summers, I'll go do some lab work. The kind of science I was doing was not something you can dabble with. But I'm a curious person, and I was trained in research. And so everything I do in the classroom feels like, I can't wait to see how they answer that. And will it change from this to that from last year? Or how will this impact them? But I think I owe a lot of credit to people that have entered my life as mentors, because I'm not sure I would have independently gotten to where I got with education research without mentors. So at our university, in our Center for Faculty Excellence, I always credit one of our colleagues, Bob Henshoff. He saw I was going to make a change to my teaching. He was like, wait, we need to collect some survey data before you do that. That was really important for someone to say, stop, let's think about this as research. Obviously, I was like, oh yeah, we should do that. But I was such a lab scientist that I wasn't really thinking about how you do research with people. And collecting the data doesn't mean you have to do anything with it. But once you miss the opportunity to collect it, it's gone. And then having people to collaborate with the skill set I don't have around doing social science research has been really important. And I learned from all of those people, including Viji. But probably a pivotal moment for me related to research was bringing some of my initial data to a conference called SABRE, the Society for the Advancement of Biology Education Research. Scott Freeman had just published a paper, I don't remember what the name of it was, but it was about structure. And it was about how increasing structure could improve achievement and performance for certain student groups. But really, it was about the idea of structure. I was looking at my data and I thought, I think I have the same kind of data. And he just published this in, I think it was Science or PNAS. I can't remember which one, but a big deal. And I said, I'm going to be brave and I'm going to walk up to him at SABRE and introduce myself to him and ask him to come look at my poster. And before he even got to my poster, I got to explain a little bit of what was on there. And he had this huge grin on his face. And he's like the nicest person ever, but I hadn't met him. He immediately was like, oh, you're onto something really big here. And your data set is way better than the data set we have access to. And what do you need? What do you need to make this happen? And I was like, a mentor and a lot of help. And within no time, I was sitting down with a postdoc from his lab, who is Sarah Eddy, who published research with me. To me, that was just such a kindness and a gift, because he cared so much more about the information getting out into the world than about getting credit for it or anything. He and others have really helped me understand what research and science is about.
That's great. That's a great story. Scott Freeman, for those who don't know, he was believe he's retired now. He was at University of Washington. He's got lots of papers. He's done a lot of work on particularly large classrooms using active learning and inclusive issues in classrooms of like 800. Super large classes. I don't know if there's such a thing as super large. That's great. Thank you. Viji?
Yeah, for me, thinking about collecting data, doing research with, say, human subjects, that's not an uncommon phenomenon, especially in my line of work. I'm a quantitative psychologist by training. So even the idea of surveys and assessments, that's very, very much in my wheelhouse. So I was always doing that kind of work in my classroom spaces because I see it as a very powerful and useful tool. I think for me, there was a shift that came when I had decided I wanted to make some changes, and I did what I mentioned earlier about recording some of my videos, essentially thinking about a flipped model. This was a little over, probably about 10 years ago. And actually, the Center for Faculty Excellence is the place that got me started thinking about, they had these small grants that you could apply for redesigning your courses. And I thought, I actually need help. I need to buy the equipment that would allow me to do these recordings. And I would appreciate the support in sort of thinking through how to do this gracefully, or as gracefully as one could sort of overhaul the class. And so I applied for this grant. I got it, and it supported the equipment and the sort of expertise to kind of think through the issues. And I had a nice cushion of time to sort of think about it, sort of teach one semester the way I'd always taught, and then develop the materials for the next go around that would be recording. So I'd often teach a class and then come home and record it so that I could keep it as similar as possible, because I did have my scientific training on, and I thought all I really want to be different is the mode at which they receive this information. And I kept everything else the same, and even down to the classroom I was in and the TAs I worked with. So I really tried to keep it very consistent. But for me, a pivotal moment was when, after doing all of that work, I had all this wonderful data and no time to actually really look at what it said. And I went back to the Center for Faculty Excellence and a colleague there. So I think Kelly mentioned Bob Henshaw was the person who had handed her data. This same person came to me and said, "How's it going? Do you need help with this work? We would love to see the analysis." And he knew I was capable. I mean, that's the other thing, is I happened to have the skill set to do the work. It just wasn't the time that I had. And he said, "Well, I'd like to think about, could we get a small publication grant your way that would allow you to," I had small children. So it was the ability then to put my kids in summer camp so that I could then have some time to do the research, the actual production of the paper. And that was really transformational, to just sit down and use my training to analyze some data I had collected about classroom teaching. And then even a step further, they nudged me to present these findings at what we call a faculty showcase on our campus. So just a chance to share different kinds of things we're doing. And I remember being terrified at the prospect of sharing this with colleagues. I mean, I had gotten quite comfortable. It was nerve-wracking in the beginning to teach to 250 students or whatever it was I was doing in the beginning. I finally got around to feeling a little bit more comfortable with that. But then the notion of doing any sort of presentation to my colleagues, just, it sent me back to that place of just being terrified. I did it anyway. and I left feeling like people had lots of great questions. I just left feeling like I did something useful, and I felt like I was helpful. To me, it was the moment when I realized maybe I could have an impact besides the students in my classroom. Maybe there is another way to have an impact. And over time, working with Kelly, I see that coming back, and sort of it just keeps evolving. And now thinking about my classroom as a much bigger space, and the people I work with as a much bigger space. I built confidence over time that I could speak about these things. And of course, doing the research we did in our book, it's still, to us, it feels a little strange. It feels like we did all of this a little bit backwards, and that we were trying things in our classroom, and we were feeling like the workshops we were going to didn't really give us enough of the practical tips that we needed. So we wanted to create something of our own. And then we ended up doing it, and it was successful. And we really learned through those workshops what was resonating for people, and how we could start to really think about broadening this out besides just STEM. So how does this work in other types of classrooms? Because we saw what people were getting out of it. And those were now our sort of what Kelly talks about, the laboratory spaces. Now the people who were having conversations were really informing our work. And the book is shaped a lot by the conversations we've had over time. So I'd say for me, the transformational moments were realizing, one, that I needed the structural support to be able to do the work. It wasn't enough to just collect the data, but to say, to have somebody look at me and say, where are you with this? And how can I help you get there? And then the nudge to just share with a broader community. And that community just kept getting broader and broader. And that's why I'm super excited. Now we have an opportunity on our campus that I help lead, where we have funding for faculty who want to do this kind of work that will allow them either a course release or just acknowledging that this work takes time. and effort. And we want to be able to really support that in a way that's more than just like, keep going, you've got it, but actually like putting dollars behind it.
Right. So you help people make the time, find the time, buy the time, because that's one of the issues, right? As faculty are so busy, as our students are, everybody's busy, but to find the time to do it. What I heard, it sounds like the big moment for you was sort of suddenly realizing it's like, oh, this can be bigger than just my students. I can have a larger impact on more students more broadly by continuing this work and by sharing the work that you're doing. Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Viji and Kelly, I want to thank you both so much for making the time for us today about inclusive teaching, strategies for promoting equity in the college classroom. You have provided a small encyclopedia of strategies that will help our most challenged students succeed. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting this conversation.
For more information about Dr. Sathy and Dr. Hogan's work, please go to our website, teachingforstudentsuccess.org. There we will provide the link to their excellent website, Inclusify.com. Thank you for spending time with us today. Please share our podcast and website with your friends, colleagues, and administrators. We love hearing from our listeners. Please contact us through our website, teachingforstudentsuccess.org. If an episode has impacted your teaching, please let us know about it via, again, our website. Teaching for Student Success is a production of Teaching for Student Success Media. Let's end this podcast, as I always do, with some music by Julius H. I love the vibes. Some of Julius's music can be found on Pixabay.